Greetings, YouTube. At the time of this filming, I am working my way through the Pathfinder Bestiary number 5. It's been quite interesting, and it's kind of cool to see so much content that seems applicable to the occult adventures Pathfinder supplement, which I don't own, and it makes me really want to purchase a copy, so I may see if I can get a cheap copy out there somewhere. And it also show me that there's somebody who works for Paizo that is a conspiracy theorist, because there are some great monsters that are right out of conspiracy theories. Um, but one of the things that has becoming a little very obvious to me as I'm reading it is how much I'm still bothered by racial alignments. Now, I'm not talking about like, demons and devils and extraplanar beings that come from actual alignment planes, like Nirvana or Elysium, things like that. If they have quote unquote racial alignments, I got no problem with that. Okay, they are basically a little shard of that plane, carved off and thrown into the prime material plane. So I'm okay if they've got an alignment that is kind of coded into their divine DNA. Um, but I'm talking about the more everyday corporeal flesh and blood type of beings, even if they're weird and strange, even if they're magical beasts, or even if they're aberrations. I'm bothered by racial alignments. Now, I could kind of see some cultural preferences. So saying there's a lizard race in there that is right out of the reptilians that are supposed to be infesting, the world today, that, you get weekly world news reports about people who revealed themselves to be, reptile beings or something like all that crap. But in the book, there's a reptile race that are also they're shape changers, and they can adopt a specific uh, alternate form. They're like chameleons, with that one single form that they become. Though they can actually adopt a new form, kind of a long process, and then that becomes their new form. But that has to last. They can't. It takes like a week or something to make the transition. So it's not a rapid process. But they hide amongst other peoples, and then they reveal themselves, of course, because they're evil manipulators, things like that. Now, there could be a culture amongst these people of being hidden in the shadows and manipulating from behind their non-reptile masks. And I get that, okay? But they're shape-changing corporeal beings. They're not something from another dimension, in the sense of devils or divas or, things like that. And it bothers me that they're presented as something that always has a neutral evil or a lawful evil alignment. I would prefer the idea of a cultural bias, but I don't see any reason why one or some of these beings couldn't have split off and are doing a different cultural thing, or just an individual that decided, hey, screw this. They are the equivalent of the emo kid that wants nothing to do with the traditional family, and they've gone out into the world, and they're not evil. They're just neutral, or they're even decided to be good. I have a problem with this. We have chameleons in the game already, changelings in the game, so I get no problem with that either. Having the ability to shape change is not a big deal. But it is a big deal to me if you say, like, all orcs are evil or all goblins are evil. That's bullshit, in my opinion. You could say that orc culture makes them raiders and conquerors, or maybe just semi-nomadic. They come into an area, they raid it, they, play out the zone, they move on to another area, and the next generation they move their way back and they do it all over again. That makes them culturally, maybe horrible and the enemy of all civilized people who are sedentary, but it doesn't necessarily mean that every member of the entire group is evil. They definitely themselves do not consider themselves evil. It's like the Mongols and the Huns didn't consider themselves evil, even though the people that had to deal with them definitely didn't like them. But if you present the Huns, like they did in Mulan, as literally befanged demonic people, I got a problem with that. I hated that racist trope in that movie. I'm like, no, they weren't. They were, invaders. They were the enemy of Mulan's people, but they were not demonic beings. They were human beings. And they weren't presented that way. So essentially, I kind of want all the races to be essentially humans in the sense that they are all capable of the best and the worst that we are. Maybe they have different cultures. Maybe their makeup that makes them look at the world is far different from us. But it doesn't mean they all have to be monocultured baddies. Just like, why aren't there pacifistic Klingons? Sure, the main the overall arcing Klingon culture is a warrior ethic. They're the Spartans, the Norse, whatever you want to call them. I think Spartan probably works best for the Klingons. But it doesn't mean that all of them are like this. I hate monocultures, and I think far too much that is presented in games are monocultures. I think there's probably something to be said for having species traits, biological traits, and then having cultural traits. So you could have diverse peoples, different species living within one culture, say all in France. They have dwarves and halflings and elves and humans all living together, and they would culturally be French, even though biologically they were 4 different species. And a dwarf in France has far more in common with an elf in France than they do with a dwarf from Australia or one from South America. They don't share the same language. They don't share the same culture or background. They don't have the same diet. Even though biologically they are the same. They are the same species. They are not the same culture. I realize this does... Sorry, I have a cat hair everywhere. I realize this does add a certain level of complexity, but we'd see it in humans all the time in role-playing games. Because you'll have humans to be the only species that have different cultures. There's the American 16th century setting that I have spoken about in the past, and now I'm completely blanking on it. It's all humans. It takes place in a century before the classical era of the American Revolution, and there are witches in Massachusetts and lots of Native American cultures, and they present like a dozen different Native American cultures there, and there's French people and Spanish people and English people and Dutch people all in the same country, and each one has their own unique cultural traits, even though they're all human. You can do the same thing for the other species. Just say these are your cultural traits and these are your racial traits, your species traits, and you combine them to fit the wherever you want them to. So if you want to play the Spanish dwarf or the German elf, you can. It's only slightly more complex than we do now, and it avoids the monoculture problem that I'm talking about. That kind of gets under my craw, where it started with racial alignments. I kind of got off on a tangent there, haven't I? Well, I've been babbling long enough. So I want to ask, do you throw out racial alignments completely? Do you accept that some species do have them, like the divine versions and demons and divas and things like that? And do you like the idea of having both species traits and cultural traits in a game? Do you think that would be appropriate, or does that one additional layer of complexity bother you? Because everybody has their own levels of things they want to deal with. They may not mind cultural variations for humans, but they don't want a lot of cultural variations for the other species. That could be their thing. If that's your game, you do what you want to do. So tell me, does any of this make any sense? Because apparently I'm reacting to the cat hair and I'm tired. So I'm going to go do something else now. Let's talk about racial alignments and cultural traits.